So, Tales of Ancient Tears, a brief visual history of the Gothic. So, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. My name is Nadjah. I just want to quickly introduce myself before we start. I have a bachelor's in art history as well as a certificate in archivism. And my main points of interest within the field is mostly illustration and specifically book illustrations, which is what we're going to talk about today within the scope of Gothic literature. I'll touch on both the 19th century illustration as well as the ones that are more toward the mid 20th century. Also, before we begin, English is my third language, so just please be gentle with me. So let's begin. Part 1, a brief history of print. First of all, I think it's a good idea to just maybe go over quickly a history of the culture of print and visual culture, especially as it relates to books specifically, during the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century. What we have to understand here is that from the second half of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century, starts a very fast-paced growth when it comes to communication and media. So the betterment of printing techniques just made it so much more widely available to the masses and to mass consumption as well. There has been a steadily growing amount of media and documents that have been created since the 18th century, whether books, prints, newspapers, magazines. And since the beginning of the digital age, that number did skyrocket even more once we introduce all the different types of electronic documents that exist. So the 19th century in particular really set the groundwork for the age of mass media as we know it today, as the 19th century was a period of extreme growth for the publishing industry and the book in general. With an increased literacy, the technological growth and of printing as a medium, and capitalists just noticing just how much money could be made from books, books started being really published in ever-growing numbers during the 19th century. In that era, books were more often than not illustrated. As you can see in the slide here, I have a book from the late 18th century. At the beginning of each chapter, as well as throughout the book, as to enhance the reading experience of the audience. The late 19th century and early 20th century was an era that was called the golden age of illustration, as a lot of artists earned their lives through illustration, through books, magazines, newspapers, posters as well. And a lot of them being women, since the illustration world was a bit less closed up than the more elite world of fine arts, which made it easier for them to enter that specific market. And also, I want to talk about the fact that illustration in general and everything that has to do with the world of print has generally been considered as low art compared to the world of fine arts, so the higher arts. And the main reason being that print culture was something that was generally accessible to everyone and popular within the general population. So to sum it up again, these are the factors that really influence the rise of media and print. So technological advances, urbanization, and increased literacy, working class again with more disposable income, and the industrialization of the 19th century. One of the main techniques that was used during the 19th century when it came to printing was lithography, which is a printing technique that was widely used throughout the 19th century and was mostly popularized by how easy it was to print with that technique. It was very easy to produce these images. Basically, a lithography is an image created by the process of drawing on either a stone or a metal plate, and then, in theory, could be replicated an unlimited number of times by put it ink on this and printing that image over and over again. So this technique was mostly used for commercial purposes as well as more artistic purposes. So now let's talk about the printing culture of the 19th century. First of all, we have the caricature. And it's something that was very used during the visual culture of the late 18th century, especially in France during the time of the French Revolution, but continued to gain a lot of popularity during the 19th century, what with the whole, popularization of printing as a medium. Caricature at the time was very often on the same subject that we tend to critique today, which is politics, current events, and also whatever women decide to wear. So as you can see in the illustration in the middle, I don't think everyone can speak French, so I'll just translate for you. So it's written manière d'utiliser les jupons nouvellement mis à la mode, which means ways to use the newly fashionable skirts. So as you can see, she's just flying around. Secondly, we have the ancestor of the comic, and this second area of visual culture is a direct sequel of sorts to the caricature. It's during that period that the sequence show imagery and storytelling started getting more and more popular. And it was really the beginning of what we now know today as comics. And those little funny strips were mostly found in newspapers, which brings us to the third part of printing culture that we're going to talk about, which is illustrated press and newspapers. Just a second, I'm just going to drink a bit of water. So the third area of visual culture, which is illustrated press and newspapers. So during that era, there is a very new culture of the press that has been developed, that has been created. And I feel that someone could really talk on and on about that subject, but I'll just, stick to the basics. So as you can see, newspapers of the time were generally illustrated as to provide both entertainment and also information on current events, social events, and so on. Different newspapers were really competing for the readership. So the illustrations on the front page kept getting more and more sensational as time went by. I don't think we can see the one that's on the, I'll just try to switch you up a bit for 2 seconds. Oh, here we go. So the one on the far right side is, as you can see, is a very dramatized illustration of what's happening. And it's written in French again, un drame au jardin du Luxembourg, un fou tire des coups de revolver sur une fillette, which means that drama in the gardens, a crazy man shoot a little girl. And it's a very dramatized illustration to really showcase the event and also attract viewers to see this and they're like, oh God, what happened? So a second important part of the press at the time was the serialized stories that were in the newspapers. And I think it's very important to touch about this subject because these stories were updated daily or weekly and were also very often illustrated and then published as novels, which I think we all understand now why these novels of that era were so long-winded and long and kept going on and on and on. I mean, I would have to if I were getting paid by the chapter. So that's also a very important part of the visual culture of the 19th century. Oh, let's go back. Okay, the fashion plates. So this is also an important part of the visual culture of the time. And it's also, I think it's very important to see how illustration was a way to join the more artistic side, but also a very practical side. Illustration was with a very commercial purpose. So these illustrations were found in ladies' magazines and were spread around as to spread the latest fashion. So the most fashionable ladies could make something that was up to date and not wear the last season, because how dare they? But yes, these illustrations started appearing since the late 18th century and until the beginning of the 20th century. And so now this is the last thing that we're going to talk about, is the particular type of media that we're going to talk for the rest of the class, which is the illustrated book. And this was very popular during the 19th century, and we're going to focus on that for the next part. Part 2, illustrations in the early Gothic and 19th century Gothic. So now that I have put in context the industry as well as the readership of the 19th century, I think we can move on to talking about the actual illustrations that were in those books. So I think it's very important to talk about the level of intertextuality that exists and the dialogue that exists between the text and the image. While you can simply appreciate the art for what it is and read the story and really appreciate it as well for what it is, the experience of reading a text that is complemented by the images really enhances the appreciation for both mediums. The images communicate with the story, and the story gives a context to the images. The relationship between the word and the image is very crucial to the understanding of the illustrations and to the actual book. For illustrations during that period, it can be very hard to find the name of the artist, especially compared to the more classical forms of art like paintings and sculptures and whatnot. A lot of these artists were not very popular, and even though their work is very important in my opinion, it's still very much an underappreciated part of art history. Nonetheless, if you dig and research a lot, it can still be possible to find some of the names and images. The later part of the 19th century and earlier 20th century is much easier to research, since I said it's the era that's known as the golden age of illustration, around 1870 to 1920, and produced a lot of very well-known illustrators as well, such as T. Nielsen, who was active during the later part of that period and ended up being an art director for Disney. So they had more recognition, let's say. So now we can move on to the actual illustrations of the Gothic novels and get to talk about them a bit more. So first of all, in this slide, you can see we have illustrations of the Castle of Otranto. This one is from the 1824 edition. I mean, I'm sure you all know this book, but just in case, it's the very first Gothic novel by Horace Walpole. I searched for the illustrator name, but unfortunately, no matter how deep I tried to research, I couldn't find it. But I do think it's pretty lovely just how much it's influenced by the aesthetic also of the early 19th century, so the more medieval, romantic aesthetic. And also, since the early Gothic was very much about mysteries and ghost stories that were more set in the Middle Ages. I don't know, we can also see in the second image how ornate the illustrations are. It's very decorated. Is that a word? There's a lot of decorations going on. I don't know, I just think those illustrations are very adorable in my opinion. Okay, also for the also from the earlier Gothics, we have the Mysteries of Udolpho. I have 3 illustrations from 3 different editions. The first one is 1806, 1823, as well as 1826. And this one, I do have the name of the illustrator, who is Nadjah O in Sirs. Let's go back here. So as you can see, these illustrations really have a goal of furthering the narrative of the book and make you feel more grounded within the story. I think it's really possible to see how the composition of the image, as well as the shadows and lights, really are used to really center the character and used a lot of storytelling to tell us a bit more what's going on, but without telling us much anyway. So just let you see these ones. Okay, so this is by illustrator F.H. Townsend, the second edition of Jane Eyre. These ones are, it's also the first edition that was published under her real name and not under a pseudonym. So you can see that the cross-hatch techniques do give a bit of an unfinished quality to the illustrations, but the contrast and the shadows and the lights and the composition of the images really do give a lot of depth, and also, as I said, very much to create a very specific atmosphere and very Gothic atmosphere. So you really wonder what's going on, what's happening behind those shadows. But yes, I just really do love these illustrations as well. We do have this one is these illustrations are from the Woman in White. And earlier I told you about the novels that were, the stories that were published as a serialized form in newspapers. And these illustrations were, usually it's the other way around. The story is written in a serialized form and then gets published as a novel. But for this one, the opposite thing happened. So the novel was published in 1860, and then in 1861 got a published edition as a serialized form in Harper's Weekly. And once again, you can see the general aesthetic of the printing culture during that era for book illustrations, and how the cross-hatching techniques, the depth, the shadows, and also the one in the center, there's a grave and the looming castle in the background. It's all very Gothic, I think. And these illustrations are by the artist John McLennan. And the last thing I'm going to talk about in the context of the 19th century are going to be penny dreadfalls. Just in case that if you don't know what penny dreadfalls are, basically it's those cheaply produced booklets with that only cost a penny, hence the name, with stories that were designed to give you chills and shock you, with protagonists such as thieves and prostitutes and whatnot. It was very much about the underbelly of the city. It's about horror stories, ghost stories, murder mysteries, a lot of blood, ghosts, and whatnot. It was a very popular literature with things inside of them that would shock some other sensibilities. But even though the concept of penny dreadful started in 1830, the popularity of the penny dreadful really jumped up in toward the later part of the 19th century. And in my opinion, the penny dreadful really does bridge the printing culture of the 19th century to the one that appears in the beginning of the 20th century, which we're going to get talking about. So part 3, book covers in the second wave of Gothic romance, 1940-1970. Just a second, I'm going to drink a tiny bit of water. Okay. So The growth of the paperback industry during the beginning of the 20th century will bring really a new era of book publishing as well as book selling, especially when we think about cheap paperbacks, mass market books, and those books that were selling really, really well, and people were buying a lot of them. And the reason was that the mindset of the 20th century, in terms of book publishing, was to sell books in places where people would just buy them. So not necessarily only in bookstores, but in drugstores and grocery stores. The goal was that maybe you were waiting to pay and you see a little rack of books and you'd be, oh, this is only 50 cents. I'm already there. Just grab one and go. So the books that were then published were marketed were really easy books to sell. So you have horror, ghost stories, gothic romance, murder mysteries. So very much genre books that could easily be very formulaic and so easy to write quickly and thus publish very quickly and also sell very quickly. So more than good books, publishers really wanted books that sold well. And with that new marketing method, well, it worked. And with this, the age of the paperback started. And I'll just give you a few seconds to maybe look at the images. Maybe just show these ones here. Bring you back. Oh, I have no idea what I've done. I'll just leave you here. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to focus more on the Gothic romance, of course, but the covers that are here are the ones that come to mind when we think about the early 20th century books. And the names of these artists of the book covers can sometimes be found, but once again, it can be very hard. And it's one of the things that I think is really sad because the general field of art history is very dismissive of this type of artist. And that is a conversation for another day, but I think it's very important to shed lights on these less known parts of art history. And also during that era, book covers were really a way to tell people what they were going to get when they picked up a book. They had a very unique visual identity that was, we could say standardized in some ways. The book covers was so that people would know what they were getting when they bought the book. It wasn't about the most unique book covers, but more about an effective communication with the buyer/reader. And I'm not going to go on a full rant about this, but I think lately it's very hard to find, to know what books are about. People have somehow decided that summaries aren't good enough for us anymore, and we just paste a bunch of blurbs and testimonies about the book. And just please let me know what your book is about, please. I'm desperate. I just want to know what the book is about. So now I'm just going to present a bit what type of covers we had for these books at the time. First of all, we have romance. So, you know, very racy, risky covers. A woman being held in the buff, strong arms of a handsome man. You know, very dangerous to get caught with that. So you also have noir and mysteries. So in these covers, we can also see a very common visual identity, lots of stark shadows, contrast, people in trench coats with the guns, lurking in the dark, and the potential murder. So you know what this is about. We have sci-fi. So these covers are, now we would call them retrofuturism, but I guess at the time was only their own vision of the future and science fiction. But once again, you can see you can definitely identify a very common aesthetic between these books. Come on, okay. Horror. So these ones are a bit later down the line, so more toward the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. But I just really want to stress what I meant by visual unity and identity for the same genre. And of course, we have Gothic romance. So once again, I really just want to highlight how strong the visual identity is for the book cover of a Gothic romance. There are visual conventions that are and expectations that are in place for each genre. And I personally think that it's a bit sad that we kind of lost that common aesthetic that books used to have. So since the speed of production that was expected of this industry was really fast, and people frankly didn't consider that type of art as something worthwhile, that made it so the actual artists are very hard to find, and because it was something that was very mass produced, and unless the artist was very successful and prolific, it's very difficult to find who the artist was. And I just want to mention also that since most of these authors are women generally for this mid-20th century wave of Gothic romance, I think it also had a sort of double effect, because since it's a genre mostly written by women for women, it made it so people didn't quite attribute it a lot of value, which is why the art also didn't have a lot of value, you know, academically speaking, I guess, which I think is sad, because it's pretty, don't you think so? So this is during that era that the visual codes that now characterize what we think of the Gothic really get set in stone. The young lady wearing a nightgown and fleeing a dark mansion, and she's chased by something that we cannot see. There is this house behind her with only one light open, and her hair is flowing through the wind. And we can also see that the colors that are used are very often deep colors, very deep jewel tones as well. And the contrast between the lights and shadows is also very much used to showcase the contrast between the poor heroine and the dark, looming, menacing environment that she's in. But unlike the 19th century ink illustrations, the contrast here isn't done just in black and white, but with the vibrant colors. So you can see that the contrast is done with the more darker, deep jewel tone, like the second one in blues and purples, and then the heroine will often be wearing more of a pastel light colors. So the contrast is really done that way. And also, even with the movement and the flowiness, we can see with the dress and the hair, and it's also a game of contrast against the unyielding solidness of the background behind her. I did say it was very difficult to find names of artists, but I still want to showcase this one artist that I do like a lot. So here is Harry Barton, who is a very prolific illustrator as well. And as we can see, he really does respect a lot of the visual convention that we expect of a Gothic romance. But even if you create art within a certain set of visual expectations, it doesn't mean that you cannot create something that's very visually fresh and interesting. And the colors that Barton uses are very deep and profound, and you can see also the very visible brush strokes, which really added depth to the image that wouldn't be there otherwise. Those book covers are from the 70s, if I recall correctly. It's not late 60s, early 70s. Unfortunately, the last one I wasn't able to find any kind of information, but it's very lovely, very pretty. Okay. And also, before we finish with this part, which is about the book covers of the mid-20th century, I just wanted to maybe compare and showcase the covers that were made at this era of more classical novels. So we have the Woman in White that I showed you earlier, but a bit of illustrations of that book, and you can see how starkly different it is because of the deep colors and everything. I just thought it would be interesting. And there's also Frankenstein here that you can see. And please go back. So I just thought it would be interesting. You have the Woman in White, Northanger Abbey, Dracula, etc. Part 4 and our last part. So this is the visuals of the Gothic in cinema. So for this last part, I really just wanted to quickly touch on the visual of Gothics as they appear in our contemporary visual media, especially in cinema, and how we can see the direct influence of the two types of visual identity that relates to the Gothic and how it translates to film. First of all, I just wanted to talk quickly about the early Gothic, the early 20th century. So you have here Rebecca, that is a movie based on the famous book by Daphne du Maurier, as well as the movie Dracula 1931 that was part of the Universal Studio monsters movie of the time. So you had The Mummy and The Bride of Frankenstein and all these type of movies. And I have very mixed opinions about his chart as a person, but I have to admit that as a movie maker, this movie really set the visual conventions of Gothic for the film industry, and was also directly inspired by the early illustrations that we Gothic illustrations. So now let's talk about A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, 2014, director Anna Lily Armipour. So this movie is a 2014 Iranian vampire movie. If you haven't seen it, I wholly recommend it. And what we can see is that visually it's possible to link this movie to the first type of illustration that we talked about when it comes to the Gothic novel. So the early 19th century illustrations. And also because when we think about shooting a movie in black and white in today's world, it's a very conscious choice that it's being made. So the filmmaker really decided to film that movie in black and white. And I think, in my opinion, there's a lot of parallels that can be made visually, especially with the Gothic illustrations and the careful composition and the shadows and the contrast and all of that. And secondly, we have Crimson Peak 2015 by Guillermo del Toro. And he created what is visually a very beautiful Gothic romance and is directly inspired visually by the 20th century book covers, as you can see, especially when it comes to the visual conventions that we talked about earlier, with the deep jewel tones and the heroine wearing her nightgown and fleeing and all of that. I just think it's very interesting how the general aesthetic of these of the movies and the posters were very directly referencing the mid-20th century book covers, even though the story were more talking about the earlier Gothics. And with this, thank you very much for listening to my class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something new today, and that it was very interesting for you. And thank you again for giving me this opportunity. It was very fun. And hello again.
Hello. Well, thank you for that. We've been very much enjoying discussing the covers in the chat. Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much for taking us on this little whirlwind tour. It's really
Thank
fun.
you for having me.
Yeah, of course. No, it's great. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask, or anything they want to bring up or ask about? Yeah. You can do that in the chat, or you can do it by video, but just remember I am recording, so you'll come up in the video if you are asking a question with your camera on. There's a question at the bottom, Nadjah, for you. Yeah, I do know the answer, but I'll let you answer.
For the Iranian vampire movie title, that it's a girl walks home alone at night. It's very good. So just watch it if you can. It's very excellent.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good one for our film club. I'll pop it on one week.
I do think you should do that. Yes, you told me you haven't seen it yet, and I was just like, "What are you doing, Sam? Just watch it."
I know. I'm secretly a terrible goth, basically. Anyone else have a question or a thought?
Hi, can I ask something?
Yes, of course, please. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, can't quite see the room, if you know what I mean. Love the talk. Thank you so much. It was really, really good. I wanted to ask a little bit about your process, because I haven't seen a lot of these covers before, and I was wondering how easy or difficult it is to research them and how you find your source materials, please.
For the can you repeat for the printer?
The actual covers. Where did you find the research materials?
I really went on an internet rabbit hole. There was really nowhere around it. Unfortunately, I really tried to find more academic, sources, but unfortunately it was really difficult because I don't think a lot of people decided that it was worth studying. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I really went through a rabbit hole of Googling and then back researching images to find where they came from. And it was just a whole process like that.
Because I should imagine the little books themselves are quite valuable now. There'll be people that collect them, won't there?
Yeah. I found even on eBay, they sold them for quite a high price, like maybe $50 for one or something. So yeah, they're quite valuable now.
I think, is it Rebecca Bauman, or Arkham Librarian on Twitter, regularly posts about Gothic romances. She's got thousands, and she posts about the covers. So she's sort of got, I think she's an archivist or librarian, and she's also got a sort of personal collection. So she's quite a good source of information if people.
Interesting. I'd be interested if you send me the link later. I would be very interested.
There's another question there from Kenneth, I think.
Yeah, I do think so, and sometimes even the stories didn't fit the cover. I remember reading a story about the woman who tried to write a Gothic story, but she completely changed the expectations. So it wasn't set in a castle, it was set in another place, and the hero wasn't a dark, brooding mansion dweller or whatever, and it was a farmer. And yet, when at the end of that process, she wrote that book, and the cover was still the same cover that we expect in a visual, in a Gothic romance. And I found that really interesting, that they really just put the cover on the story, no matter if the story really was a Gothic romance or not. Mm-hmm. So yeah. I do think that happened in Gothic as well. Yes, thank you for the question.
Anyone else got a question? I think what I'll probably do is I'll just say thank you to Nadjah once again and turn the recording off so people can feel a bit freer to chat.
Thank you,
Nadjah.